Notable albums of 2024. Right, here is my list of notable albums released in the 2024 year of our Lord. I by no means have included everything that has piqued my interest in 2024. For example, the new Nile album is a wonderfully crafted and adroit piece of extreme metal. And just in case you haven't read the title above, this list is primarily concerned with music of such an ilk. And whilst I certainly enjoy listening to it, I have found it has not drawn me back in a sufficient enough of a manner as to warrant a place on this list. Therefore it, as well as many others, are not included in the approaching commentary. So without further ado, on to the albums that have drawn me back frequently and are included in my list. First up, an album I only recently discovered in December and have been addicted to ever since. The band in question is Moss Upon the Skull, and the album is entitled Quest for the Secret Fire. So a few words on it then. A wonderfully natural sounding production offers a strange blend of Anatar and early Mastodon riffs. There is definitely some sections reminiscent of the Fallock debut later in the album too. What really sets this apart for me, though, is just the sheer excellence of the compositions. Everything feels 100% natural and flows into subsequent passages effortlessly. Elements of songcraft are constrained when necessary, but never feel restrictive. Similarly, they know just when to inject a little more aggression when needed. All instruments can clearly be distinguished throughout, whilst retaining a cohesive overall sound. I particularly enjoy the bass tone. The whole album is just a masterclass in well thought out, unusual and interesting metal music. Superb. 10 out of 10. Next up, Severe Torture, Torn from the Jaws of Death. Now, I must confess I have a special place in my heart for this particular band. I was now obsessed with Misanthropic Carnage when it came out in the early 2000s, and it is still one of my favourite records of all time. I got to see them live in around 2005-6-ish, I think, on the Fall of the Despised tour with the self-proclaimed Welsh death metal bastards Desecration in support. It was a woefully small crowd for such an amazing band, as a lot of the shows were back then. Thankfully, the talent it takes to produce and perform such music as Severe Tortures is now much more greatly appreciated with the rise of the YouTube reaction video. Anyway, I digress. On to Torn from the Jaws of Death, which does something to the teenage part of my brain. Every note on this album is delectable death metal for my personal palate. It feels like a culmination of early and mid-era Severe Torture albums. Yes, there are more of the musically mature, moody instrumental elements that were introduced in the mid-phase of the band, but nowadays, and to my ears at least, they feel far more in place than they did back then. Feasting on Blood and Misanthropic Carnage will always be untouchable in terms of youthful ferocity, but as an overall sound of this incredible death metal band's career, I have no other option but to score this excellent album another 10 out of 10 for my own personal tastes. Fantastic songwriting, attitude and aggression throughout. Next up, Wormed and their brutal masterpiece, Omegon. Or Omegon, I'm not quite sure how I should pronounce that. I will go with Omegon, I think. Omegon, meh. Another band that has never disappointed. Incredibly complex song structures and rhythms with unbelievably brutal vocals. I'm not sure if Omegon is quite to the same level as 2019's Metaportal EP, which was so intense it was almost an act of brutal death metal apotheosis. But it is certainly up there in terms of their ridiculous calibre of musicianship and intensity throughout. As with all Wormed albums, this takes time to digest. However, many repeat listens will reveal the sheer genius behind some of these compositions and time signatures, further producing pleasure for the attentive ear. Highly recommended. Now, seeing how, as we are on the subject of brutal death metal, let us examine my favourite band in the genre, which is, of course, Defeated Sanity. And in this case, it's their masterful album, Chronicles of Lunacy. I genuinely believe that this band are the finest the genre has to offer. Incorporating jazzy time signatures and brutal death metal into a cohesive entity is no mean feat, but Defeated Sanity have undoubtedly mastered the act. The songs are incredibly dense and complex, bringing the listener ever closer to the edge of the swirling void, before pulling them back to a simple and familiar 4/4 crushing riff. It is this that makes the band so listenable for me. If it was all just impossibly complex chaos, it would lose the impact and heaviness. But by switching between the two disciplines, they give the listener the much-needed guide to keep exploring the chaos with a renewed perspective. A fresh perspective, if you will. Each time a familiar time signature is reintroduced. That'll do. I also love the drum sound on this album, where I fancy some care has been taken to retain the organic sound and performance of a real human. At least I think Mr. Gruber is somewhat human. You can hear the occasional natural dynamics and slight inconsistency and velocity of a prolonged blast beat, instead of everything being triggered or ultra-compressed into the levels of the unnatural and inhuman. Just such an amazing band who genuinely seem to improve with every single release. Sheer quality. Next up, Ingurgitating Oblivion, Ontology of Naught. Well, where to begin with this one? Probably the single most dense and intriguing piece of extreme metal I have ever listened to. Effortlessly, it floats from one dichotomy of sound and tone into another refraction of perplexing sonic soundscape. And it does this consistently throughout the epic journey that is the album as a whole. The structures are hugely complex and challenging. Often the breadth of instruments and layers can become almost overwhelming. It could be so easy for something like this to become a complete chaotic mess, and it very nearly is at times, but there is definitely a touch more genius than madness on display here. It's not an album I will listen to on a particularly regular basis. It is an album that I will have to be in the right mood for, but a solo headphone listen on this is quite something, I can assure you. Expertly woven, but unravel at your own peril. You have been warned. Right, back to some sort of familiar sonic territory with this one. It is Nocturnus AD with their album Unicursal. Now, I have always been a fan of keyboards correctly implemented into extreme metal, i.e. a band that actually utilises a keyboard player along with their guitarists. There are few finer examples of this than Nocturnus. The production of this album sounds like it's straight out of 1992, as do the vocal patterns and riffs. If you want a genuine and familiar portal to the past days of masterful metal, then this is the album for you. With the density of some of the aforementioned releases, Nocturnus provide a welcome ride of somewhat easy listening, one that I have been drawn back to many times in 2024. I would liken it to watching a familiar sci-fi film of the 1980s on VHS. It has all the horror and shock, but it is also a comfortable and reassuring experience. Nocturnus' style is firmly established, and for good reason too. Great album. Next up, Piron Exhaust. I have been following these Masters of Discord since the early days of An Excellent Servant but a Terrible Master. And that was definitely their most traditionally structured death metal album, which then got completely blindsided by the madness that was the Mother of Virtues. I have kept a close eye on all their releases from those early days, and I reckon Exhaust might just be their finest work to date. They finally seem to have found the right balance between chaos and order for my tastes. I also think the vocals on this album are the best so far. Great range and dynamics throughout. His lows have definitely improved since earlier releases. If you have not heard Piron before, now is the time to do so. As a side note, watching them live is one of the most memorable gigs I have been to. They played alongside the excellent grime band Department of Corrections in a tiny basement venue, and it was more like watching a performance art piece than a gig. The music was that strange when played in such a close proximity and at such high volume that my friend and I both walked out afterwards asking ourselves what exactly it was we had just witnessed. Next up, Sjozdog Lore. I'm not much of a black metal fan these days. I have nothing against the genre per se, but I must confess a lot of what is released these days feels very homogeneous and stale in comparison to the greats of old. Thankfully, this is certainly not the case with Sjozdog and their latest offering, Lore. This is another band I was lucky enough to discover on their debut, and they have remained one of my favourite black metal acts since. The band has since refined itself to the two core members, and I really appreciate the fact that they are treading their own path. The riffs of Shortdog have always been in the dark, doomy spectrum, giving everything else room to work in the dark magic of the mix. The black metal vocals of Volnus have always been my favourite in the genre, and he retains his signature rasp just as well as on any previous record. Another thing that Shortdog do, which you very rarely hear on any other album, is that they sometimes manipulate the master track so everything will drop out to a certain effect for a time before returning to the established mix. This adds another element of experimentation which is unique to the sound of Shortdog. Like I said before, this is a band firmly treading their own intriguing path, come hell or high water, and I have huge respect for that. A very fine release indeed. Keeping in the experimental vein, next up we have Construct of Leth, a kindness dealt in venom. This time it's not experimental black, but experimental death metal. Initially I was put off by the very clean and modern production of this record, as I much prefer the sound of the earlier release, Elixir. Phenomenal record, by the way. But after the ears became accustomed to this, I really began to enjoy the journey. And that is what this is from start to finish. Finish, that'll do. I furnish my finish with a finish. Nice finish. A deep journey into hellish death metal sonic landscapes. The important word in that sentence is the death metal bit. For whilst this release does dance around the place in terms of what it does sonically, it is always able to maintain the connection to the underlying death metal structure. It never feels like an arbitrary tangent just for the sake of it. Really interesting release, and I will be following these guys closely to see how this new direction progresses in the future. Next up, some black and roll. It's Deathrite, Flames Licking Forever. Imagine if Carpathian Forest and Entombed had an unholy love child together. Well, its name would be Deathrite, and it would seriously kick some backside. The Lord forgive me for using his name in vain, but goddamn, this album makes me want to drink copious amounts of alcohol and just headbang. Pure. Simple, catchy, memorable, and oozing with that punky attitude that black metal can do so well. This one is just a certified banger. Simple as that. Fucking awesome. Check it out. Right, back to the abstract. Next up, it's Gigan with their album Anomalous Abstrugate Infinitesimus. Anomalous Abstrugate Infinitesimus. Phew, what a mouthful. And it's certainly an earful too. I have been following these guys since their debut, and they are another band that just seems to get better with every release. It's essentially death metal in the vein of, say, Origin maybe? I mean, more so in the impish riff department than the super speed, although Gigan are certainly no slouches when it comes to the tempo either. Riffs that have a healthy splattering of guitar pedals feeding through layers of psychedelic effects to produce an abstruse cacophony of virulent death metal chaos. Sounds messed up, right? Well, it is, and it's bloody marvellous. A band that is moving into a new sonic realm. It often feels like they are on the cusp of unlocking a new unseen level of the death metal game. My only minor gripe with this album is the track listing, as it feels that some of the momentum is lost with the more abstract interludes which are strategically placed throughout. However, this is a minor concern, and they certainly sufficiently punish the listener regardless. A phenomenally inventive band that I have already witnessed grow from strength to strength, and hopefully will continue to do so far, far into the future. Mind-bending stuff. Keeping the intensity up, we delve into the extreme world of Vicarious and their excellent album, that'll do, Suffer and Become. Now, if there was ever a case of genuine artists making genuine music, these guys would fit the bill. From the interviews I have watched, it seems they fully embrace the music and the toll of the life it entails. It certainly shows in this incredibly intense album. There is sorrow, hatred and anger aplenty to be found between its playtime, and it is a truly punishing and emotionally draining album to listen to. Not for the weak of heart, forsooth. However, it is also an absolute masterpiece of sheer intensity. It really is remarkable what these chaps accomplished with Suffer and Become. An album title most befitting of their life journey, it seems. I just hope the price is not too high. It must be utterly exhausting to maintain this level of ferocity in the way that they do. And finally, a new discovery for me this year. It's Veil of Pnath with their album Between the Worlds of Life and Death. Now, I have never heard of these guys until this year, and I am really glad I did, because not only is this an excellent album, but they also boast a very impressive back catalogue. Technical and melodic death metal with a dark vibe to it. The opening track certainly has a Behemoth flavour. Thankfully it doesn't linger there too long, and where this band really shines for me is on the faster tracks. The driving, epic, electronic and classical sound that these guys generate, along with the ferocious, technical and razor-sharp riffing, is extremely impressive. Give them a go. Well, that's about it for my 2024, I think. Like I said at the beginning of this video, there are many more albums I have enjoyed in 2024, but these are the real standout ones for me, the ones that have drawn me back time and again. If you have any more suggestions, please put them in the comments below for others and I to enjoy. I will also link a playlist here somewhere if any of you want to check out the music I've mentioned above. Happy listening, and I'll see you in 2026 for 2025's notable albums. Cheers and Happy New Year.